Got it. Thank you, Austin. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating the last couple of 3 days. This is one of our very special sessions. We will have a national update on elder justice issues, but we have a very special guest with us this afternoon that is a friend of ours and a friend of yours in the elder justice and elder service space, and that's our own Senator Becky Massey, and we would like to bring her to the podium now. Becky, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for inviting me. Sorry I can't stay long. I've been sandwiched. This is between several appointments, and I'm going to step out. But I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing every day, making a difference in the life of some of our most vulnerable people in our state. And you all are changing lives and, making a difference in their quality of life. Many of you know for 25 years I was a disability provider over at Sertoma Center serving adults with intellectual disabilities. So my passion is for, to do what I can do for folks to kind of support the work you're doing. So we're working on a couple of bills that we didn't quite get over the finish line this year, but give me time, I'll get them done. But one of them is our small group home licensing bill, which it's kind of falls into a crack that there's no real place or box for it to check. And of course, I dealt with licensing for many years, and I know the kind of things they're looking for, like out-of-date carrots and things like that. So we're going to keep working on that. And I think you've heard some more this morning about our elder financial abuse legislation that we're passing with the call center, working with Director Roush. I still call him Chief all the time, but it's and Commissioner Gonzalez, good to see you, and it's really needed. It's just identified elder financial exploitation is $500 million a year in Tennessee, and we know that's a low number. And so we've got to give more tools to, our law enforcement and to our banking financial institutions to be able to counterbalance that and be able to take care of our folks that are being preyed upon. I'd say 50% of that is by family members or somebody they know well. And I think 70% of that is addiction related. So we need to give you all the tools so we can protect these folks to not be preyed upon. April asked me what was the name of the bill, and I said, well, we don't have any cute acronyms. I guess Elder Financial Exploitation, the EVE bill, I don't know. But anyway, we're going to get it passed, but thank you for the work that you do. You all are amazing and making a difference every day. And if I can ever be of any help, just holler at me. Y'all have a great rest of the conference.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Massey, for being with us on a busy Thursday. And so we heard from Congressman Burchett this morning, from the state senator this afternoon, so we've got it covered. It's great. So this is the session that we entitle to give you a kind of a national update on what's going on, as well as in Tennessee and other parts of the United States, and to give you a kind of 30,000-foot overview of some of the issues, policies, and challenges ahead. One of the things I've always been struck by is that you invite people within the state of Tennessee to be here, and what's impressed me is that they don't just be here to give a 5-minute talk, but they stay throughout the conference. And I'm referring to our first speaker as one of them, Mr. James Dunn, who, as you know, is the director for the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability, and next week he'll celebrate his 2nd anniversary of that appointment, right, from being appointed by Governor Lee to that position. So just personally, I want to thank you for being here for these 2 days and for giving us your time, not only now, but in the workshop too. So would you join me in re-welcoming Mr. James Dunn? Thank you so much.
I appreciate those kind words. It's good to be here with everybody. I feel like I'm the cover band right here, and the big band's about to come on stage because we are going to have a conversation on what's going on federally. I just got some numbers the other day. From 2021, our comptroller tells me that we have, at that time, I know we have more than that now, it's 1.7 million folks who are 60 and older, but at that time, from 2021, we had 1.6 million plus folks 60 and older. Yet we actually had 1.5 plus who were 17 and younger. So I'm telling you, you hear a lot about the 2034 data and how we're going to cross that threshold of having more people who are 65 than 18. I'm telling you right here, right now, today, in the state of Tennessee, out of 7 million people, we have more people who are 60 and older than we do who are children in this state. This is the most underestimated public policy issue of our time. And the beauty of coming to a conference like this is to understand what's going on, not only in our state, but also nationally. So I appreciate the great work that these ladies and gentlemen do, and I look forward to working with them going forward. I always try to do this whenever I see them in the room, Director Roush and his team, law enforcement, teaming them up with adult protective services, with our social welfare services, coming together and looking at this population holistically is super duper important. There's also some staff, so for those of you that are local, I do want to point out, and if you could stand up, I'd appreciate that. Marcia D. McShane. Marcia D. McShane is our Director of Unlicensed Facilities. I'll talk a little bit about that. Teresa Teeple is our long-term care ombudsman. She's done a fabulous job. She's worked in 4 separate states before this. Tremendous relationship with ACL. She's doing a great job, and I think we're going to do a lot more there as well. And then Shannon Atkins, if you could stand up. Shannon Atkins is a program person for us. For the first time, we're going to have a programs person in Shannon to actually start coordinating these elder justice issues within the SUA at the state level, which we have not had within our SUA. We've done a wonderful job out here in East Tennessee, West Tennessee, APS, some other folks. Oh, and I also should say thank you to APS is not with the SUA, as you all know. It's with the Department of Human Services. Is a friend of mine and a friend of many of you all. He's the former Undersecretary of Adult Community Living under President Trump. He also is a former Secretary of Aging. He's a former member of the United States Army, where he served 8 years honorably. And he now is a consultant who, although he's in the private sector, goes around this country helping out states to improve and evolve their systems on aging and health care. He's a wonderful human being. Lance Robertson. Thanks, sir.
All right, thank you, James. I appreciate that. Has it been a good conference?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I know your mouths are full. Thanks for not spitting food everywhere. What a great conference. So glad that you were here. So glad you've invested the time. And a matter of fact, I wanted to just, in my brief remarks, sort of start off and offer a bit of perspective, because you do have, as participating faculty in this conference, some folks that have a sort of a national view of what's happening around elder justice, folks like Paul and Bill and Laura, and what we can all pretty much uniformly tell you is what you have going on here in Tennessee, specific to addressing abuse, neglect, and exploitation, is unique. And I tell you that because you may not have that perspective, right? I mean, your focus is local, your focus is what's happening here in the state of Tennessee. This is a statewide conference, but I thought it could be heartwarming for you to appreciate the fact that you're in a special place at a special conference doing special things. There are very few states that have statewide elder justice conferences every year. As Bill's nodding his head, we can tell you that. There are very few states where this sort of priority goes all the way up to the governor. There are very few states where, they're doing some great things around stuff that matters, like unlicensed facilities, like James Dunn's doing and his team. And, there's so many other examples that we could talk about today. And I really just wanted to start off and provide that message for you, because perspective is important. I think you should leave here with your head high, your chest out, knowing that you're in a state where this is a priority. And that's important because I know that as soon as you get back tomorrow morning and the real world hits you yet again in the face, and you've got a pile of emails to go through, you got cases to address, you got crises to handle, sometimes it's easy to forget how special this week has been. So please just carry this with you. Know that Tennessee is doing remarkable things. You guys are certainly industry leaders in many respects. So I think that perspective is an important one to offer. I also want to just give a couple of quick shout outs and ask that you do the same before you leave by acknowledging and thanking folks that are key, of course, in making this conference happen, starting with Aaron Bradley and his team. I think probably all of you know Biggie. Yeah, thank you. Big events like this just don't happen overnight. This is a year's worth of work. I suspect Aaron and his team will take a little bit of time off, probably not much, and they'll start working on next year's conference. As a matter of fact, Aaron and I were already talking about 2025 just a little bit earlier. So big vision, but a lot of work. So thank Aaron and his team when you have a chance. Another person, the gentleman that introduced me, I need you to appreciate that every state has a state unit on aging director. Probably one of the more thankless jobs, because so much of what you do has to involve managing the internal politics within your state, managing I'll say, anemically funded Older Americans Act, making sure that older adults who are vulnerable are cared for. It's a tough job. So the fact that Tennessee State Aging Director spent the week here at this conference, the fact that he is so committed to this issue is special. So I hope that before you leave this conference, you will say thank you to James Dunn, and I think you need to give him a quick round of applause. Thank you. Man, feels like I'm preaching here, Aaron. I don't know. All right, so this particular conversation, as Paul had pointed out, has more of that federal flavor to it, and I think that's also exciting because I mentioned perspective a little bit ago. Paul talked about his P's. Did you talk about your P's the other day? Okay, perspective is another P.
That's true.
Yeah, so what's happening at the federal level is often something that I know you don't have the time to pay attention to. You've got a lot of pressing issues in your own community. The work you're doing is so very critical. So I'm really glad that Aaron put some time on the calendar, put some time on this conference agenda to talk about what's happening federally. Why? Well, first of all, you probably know that as a taxpayer, you should be clear on what's happening to support abuse, neglect, and exploitation efforts that are being funded federally. You're paying into that, so that's important. Secondly, of course, it goes without saying, so much of what happens relative to funding starts in DC, tied to what I just mentioned, but also relative to policies and procedures, initiatives, things that are going to directly support and impact abuse, neglect, and exploitation efforts. So here in a minute, when you hear from Laura and Bill, they've got great perspectives on some of that granularity. That's not what I'm going to cover. They'll cover that granularity. But it is important, again, just as a quick note of appeal to you, pay attention to what's happening in the federal space around this issue. I'll give you a few quick examples here in a moment, but I think so often as a plea to, again, our network, we have so many people doing fabulous things at the local and state level, but so few times does some of that good work trickle up to policymakers and appropriators in DC, and that's what we need to hear more about. Things that are working, success stories, innovation, things that really matter and are moving the needle locally are things that need to be replicated and understood, and a partner that sometimes is left out of that conversation is the federal partner. And by the way federalism works, the federal government is supposed to, first and foremost, support what a state needs. A state, in turn, is supposed to support what the local community needs. But yet so often we kind of invert that, and we sort of feel like we take our marching orders from DC and then from the state, and really it's supposed to be the other way around. So the best way, again, to assure that more of that happens is for you to have a voice, for you to reach out and to talk to your federal delegation. As a matter of fact, I would say as homework assignment number one, if you don't already know your federal delegates and you don't have a regular communication pipeline to their office, you have one here, of course, locally and in your state, and you're certainly welcome to contact them in DC. I would ask that you take some time and actually send them a note. Tell them about what you do. Tell them why it's so important. Tell them why it makes a difference to Tennesseans, their constituents. They'll appreciate it. I think so few people do that. I think some are intimidated, some don't know what to say, some, hogwash. What Bill, Paul, Laura, and I, others that have worked at the federal level can tell you, Congress needs to hear from you. They need to understand what's happening at the ground level. They need to understand what your needs are, how to best support your work. So again, it's imperative that you take an opportunity to really sit down and do that, to advocate, to plug in. And speaking of plugging in, as another homework assignment, I would encourage you to do your very, very best to just remain informed on what's happening. And some of the better ways to do that would be to sign up for a lot of the free communication pieces that get pushed out of DC. So Laura will talk about the one that she and Bob Blancato and NANASP put out. Bill's going to preach quite extensively around NAPSA's important work. Paul and I are good resources for you as well. I would encourage you as a former ACL administrator, the ACL newsletter is free. Sign up for that stuff, folks. I know, again, you're busy, and I'm not saying dedicate hours upon hours to reading through it all, but at least take a moment when that stuff lands in your inbox to open it up and say, oh my gosh, this, and this are some key issues I want to plug into and I want to understand more about. So again, I want to encourage you, be educated, all right? So critical. Something I want to just briefly touch on that I suspect most in the room probably don't know a whole lot about. And speaking of the federal government's response and the role that they play in preventing abuse, neglect, and exploitation, the federal government has something called the Elder Justice Coordinating Council. So by show of hands, do I have some folks in the room that are familiar with the Elder Justice Coordinating Council? Oh, see, I was afraid of that, just a few folks. So I think you'll be very pleased to know, and as homework assignment number 3, it's a holiday weekend coming up. You got some time. Jump on a website, look up Elder Justice Coordinating Council. You're going to find it through my former federal administration, the Administration on Community Living. I chaired the federal government's Elder Justice Coordinating Council. Essentially, it is a council of now, or at least when I left, 14, maybe more federal, 14, 15 federal agencies that come together, typically on a bi-monthly or quarterly basis, and really dig in and talk about better collaboration, joint programs, ways to collectively fund some efforts around the elder justice space. And I just want to, if I could point you again to one thing, and if you want to really know what the federal government's doing around abuse, neglect, and exploitation, jump on that Elder Justice Coordinating Council website and take a look. The other thing that's great is that often, at least when I was in DC, I assume it's the same, often those meetings are open to the public. So you can actually listen in. You can hear what each of these 14, 15 federal agencies are doing to fund and to support elder justice across this country, those programs, those initiatives, those key things that matter. So again, Elder Justice Coordinating Council. Type that in. You're going to go again to the Administration for Community Living's website. That's another, by show of hands, do many of you know about the Administration for Community Living? Please, for the love of God, a few people, okay. So ACL, just so you know real quickly, and Paul said we have a little extra time, so that's why I'm preaching longer than I was planning on it. So the Administration for Community Living is one of 11 operating divisions within the Department of Health and Human Services. You guys have all heard of the Department of Health and Human Services, I suspect. That's a $1.7 trillion, $1.7 trillion federal agency. ACL is one of the 11 agencies under the ACL umbrella. You'll recognize the others, little boutique ones like CMS, $600 billion organization, FDA, NIH, Indian Health Services, etc. But ACL is right there with them. The focus is on supporting older adults and people with disabilities to remain in the community. 140 million Americans. And the reality is, I know I'm biased, there could be no more critical mission at the nation's capital than supporting community living for older adults and people with disabilities. You do that work. That needs to be much more of the mainstream conversation. And we're all trying, we need your help. That needs to be a priority. There's growing momentum. But again, I think the secret sauce, if we want a healthy country, healthy communities, is to do everything we can to better support community living for older adults and people with disabilities. I always called it the trifecta win, because when you support community living, number one, that's what people prefer, right? Do you prefer to stay in your own home and in your own community as you age? I don't need to ask for a show of hands because I suspect every one of you. Now statistically, isn't it right, Bill, that 1 out of 10 don't prefer to stay in the community? I still don't know where that AARP number comes from, but anyway, we'll just say the majority of folks want to stay in the community. So that's the first win. The second win is the health outcomes are better. Are you going to age better in an institution? Or are you going to age better and more healthfully in your own home? Pretty easy. And then the third thing, the most important trifecta component if you're in DC, where money is the only thing that matters, community-based services are less expensive. So you're talking about what people prefer, health outcomes are better, it's less expensive. Trifecta win. So again, I know that ties into the mission of everybody in this room. You're all about that. So thank you again for your great work in that regard. The thing I'll close with, and we had some people that I think were in the session that John Byers and I did this morning, so for those of you that were in that session, this will be a bit of a repeat, but I want to close with this. A bit of a personal challenge. So, you know, one of the responsibilities when you're the Assistant Secretary on Aging is you often get called to Capitol Hill to be loved on. Not really. You guys have seen the TV coverage of being called to Capitol Hill to testify, and often you're dealing with a very cranky committee who wants answers to questions for where there really often are no answers. So I remember vividly tying to this conversation. I was testifying to the Senate Help Committee. My good friend from Pennsylvania, Senator Casey. Nobody's from Pennsylvania, right? Okay, good. We'll talk about, don't say anything to Senator Casey. Senator Casey and I are good friends, but on that given day, for some reason, he just did not want to give Lance any love. So he was just beating the hell out of me. And it was around elder justice. And I don't blame him. He was frustrated. Regular calls from constituents talking about how they've been exploited, and he wanted to know what protections were in place. So we did the basic 101 and covered everything. But, you know, he was being pretty relentless. So there just came a time when I was like, you know what? It's time to just be honest and just be frank with Senator Casey and the committee. So I just said, Senator, here's the reality, and this ties into my final plea to all of you. I said, Senator, there is no conceivable way that the federal government alone is going to be able to eradicate abuse, neglect, and exploitation in this country. It's not possible. No matter how you do the numbers, no matter how many initiatives, how many programs you fund, not possible. The only solution to eradicating abuse, neglect, and exploitation is if we can make this personal. And if we can actually challenge every American to insulate their own home, their own family from being victimized and start building up from there, that's the solution. And I even told the senator, I told the committee at that time in a very real moment of vulnerability, I said, Senator, I've been in this role at the time about 2.5 years. I said, I've been in this role 2.5 years. I chair the federal government's Elder Justice Coordinating Council. I think I know a little bit about elder justice. But while I've been in DC, my family has been victimized not once, not twice, but I can tell you right now 3 stories of how the Robertson household was victimized while I was up here doing my job. And I told the committee, I said, shame on me. Because what I need to do is commit myself to making sure that the Robertson household is better informed, more alert, more aware that these scammers don't take a break. They don't have any empathy. And we need to be more diligent and smarter about it. I had a grandmother that was exploited. I had an uncle that was exploited. And I had my own father who was exploited. Got one of those phone calls from the IRS. You do know the IRS, will they call you? My dad should have known that. I should have made sure he knew that. He didn't. So he paid a $175 retainer fee to make sure they didn't prosecute. You know how it goes. Paul's seen them all the time. So long story short, and again, this is my challenge to you. It has been my mission, particularly since that congressional testimony that I just shared with you, that story. I have made sure that every member of my family understands that if something is even the slightest bit suspicious, they are to call me. And I know I can count probably on 2 hands the number of times I think we've cut some things off with the past simply because I knew that I needed to be that resource and I needed to make them aware. So my challenge to you is when you leave here, and yes, I know what you do professionally, but when you leave here, are you going to do your very best to make sure that your own household is protected from exploiters? Are you going to make sure that you are a abuse-free zone when it comes to these sorts of crimes that are happening everywhere? And if it can start with each one of the 200 of us in this room, think about the energy and the momentum there. It's powerful. And again, I think it's very doable. You don't have to be the expert. You don't have to be the vigilant 24/7 gatekeeper. You just have to make sure those family members know that when something seems funny, to pause and ask, and you need to be that resource. And again, I think that the power in that is pretty limitless. So again, that would be my fourth, I think, homework assignment for all of you, is to sort of take that challenge on. As I shared in the last session, again, I know what all of you do professionally, but my question would be, if you invited me to your family reunion, and we passed out a survey, and we asked your family how prepared they are to avoid being exploited, would you be happy or would you be terrified of what those results might show? I dare say most of us would be terrified. So then it's a pretty simple challenge. So with that, again, so glad to be here with all of you in the wonderful state of Tennessee. Can't wait to go back to Oklahoma where it's 104 today. But again, it's been great being with all of you. Thanks for your tremendous work. Bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lance. You know, you talked about family reunions, and I think that's hit a chord with some people, because over these next few days, with us coming up to independence celebrations on the 4th, there will be lots of family reunions. And maybe, just maybe, this will be the perfect opportunity. Or it may be when you'll notice something different about what happened last year. There's a change in behavior, there's a change in conversation, and that will trigger in you maybe an inquiry that could lead to maybe something beneficial. And I pick up on something else that Lance said. I always used to try to go by the phrase, act local, but think global. And that's why I've been encouraged that we have the grassroots boots on the ground in this conference today and yesterday. We've got our law enforcement folks here. We've got our APS warriors out here. We've got our homekeepers who I didn't know existed. And I'm looking at that empty table because they were sitting there yesterday afternoon. Where are you today? Oh, you're on that table. You moved over one. Okay. You know, it's you folks that do this incredible work out there and make it happen. And as we take advantage of what Lance was saying, get in touch with our federal folks. Let them know what you're seeing. Let them know what you are lacking. It's so important. We were due to have Bob Blancato here today, who's again been a tremendous supporter of these conferences, but he's had to undergo a medical issue, a procedure, and so our thoughts are with him. But we're so happy that we have in his stead Laura Borth, who has come from Asheville in North Carolina. She is the Advocacy and Policy Advisor for the Elder Justice Coalition, works side by side with Bob. In a moment, she will introduce a video from Bob. She deals with a lot of these federal issues. But also, very interestingly, she is a registered dietitian. And so I hope you'll spend a minute telling us what we need to avoid and what we should be eating more of, okay? Because I would like to hear from that. So will you join me in welcoming Laura Borth? Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. This is actually my second time at this conference, and I always learn something new every time I come. So even though I'm about to teach you a few things and introduce Bob, I'm just always happy to come here and learn something new from Tennessee. So Bob recorded a few minutes of information for you all. For those of you who don't know, Bob Blancato is the national coordinator of the Elder Justice Coalition, but that's only one of the many hats that he wears. He is really a tireless advocate for all aging issues in DC and has been for quite some time. So if you want to play his video.
It is an honor to again participate in the Tennessee Elder Justice Conference. I apologize that a tiny mole in a bad place that had to be excised has kept me in Washington, D.C. I want to salute my friend and colleague Aaron Bradley for all his hard work on this conference, and also salute all on the planning committee. I'm happy to share this session with two other great friends and colleagues, Bill Benson and Lance Robertson. Each doing different things, have been difference makers in the field of elder justice. And you will be introduced to another colleague today, Laura Borth, who was a policy and advocacy advisor to the Elder Justice Coalition and was with you last year. The state of elder justice, in all candor, is unclear, not for lack of activity, but because of bigger issues. We are now only seeing how the fiscal responsibility or debt ceiling agreement has taken over Washington. Its key provision calling for a 2-year spending cap is of deep concern. For elder justice, the issue within the issue is what fiscal year do you base the caps on, 2022 or 2023? If 2022, Adult Protective Services were not even funded under the regular appropriation process, and the long-term care ombudsman got money that was less than before. If you use 2023, the APS program will get $15 million and the ombudsman closer to $40 million. No matter what the final outcome later this year in both programs, the fiscal cliff is going to be reached. We went from $188 million to $15 million in adult protective service funding, a very serious issue, because that was emergency money separate from the appropriation process. Our strategy now is to better understand the rules of the debt ceiling to see if individual programs within an area can still get increases. On the more positive side, we do have an Elder Justice Reauthorization and Modernization Act introduced in both the House and the Senate. Senate bill authored by Senators Wyden and Casey, the House bill offered by Congressman Richard Neal and Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, with now close to 10 co-sponsors. It's a major initiative investing more than $4 billion to build long overdue infrastructure for elder justice. Laura will review the specific comments, specific provisions after my comments. Right now, the most important thing as advocates we can do is to increase the number of co-sponsors on both bills. Tennessee is vital. You need to educate and inform Senators Blackburn and Hagerty about co-sponsoring the Elder Justice Reauthorization Bill, and by doing so, making the bill, which it should be, bipartisan. Senator Blackburn is especially important as she is on the Finance Committee, where this bill will be considered and moved to the full Senate. Senator Hagerty is key for another reason. He's on the Appropriations Committee, which is in charge of funding. We need his help to get APS and long-term care ombudsman funded properly for fiscal year 24. Also reach out to your 10 House members to get their support, especially Representative Kustoff, who is on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the House committee in charge of elder justice, and Congressman Fleischman, who is on the Appropriations Committee. This is the year of anniversaries. The Elder Justice Coalition is 20 years old, and the Elder Justice Act is now 13 years old. We of the Elder Justice Coalition are still fighting to get this 13-year-old law updated, modernized, and funded. It's a fight where we need all help from you as advocates and as frontline professionals. This conference is an important convening. Let it also be a call to action so we can say with pride that we are achieving elder justice in America by working to prevent elder abuse. Thank you.
Okay, so to give you a few more details on the reauthorization, the Elder Justice Coalition, we have all of these resources in our newsletters, which you can sign up for, and on our website, so you don't have to remember any of the details I'm about to tell you. But this reauthorization would reauthorize dedicated funding for APS formula grants, enhanced training for long-term care ombudsman program, and then it includes some new provisions, grants for post-acute and long-term care worker recruitment and retention, grants to states to support linkages to legal hotlines and medical legal partnerships, and grants for AAAs and other community-based organizations to address social isolation. So we keep giving you a lot of homework. We keep telling you, you need to go tell your representatives how important this act is and to sign on as co-sponsors. So I'm going to do a shameless plug for the workshop that I am hosting after this session on advocacy and kind of a little bit of hand-holding on how easy this can actually be and how your voice is more important than my voice because you do the work. So if you want to take that next step, come to my workshop. And thank you for having me.
Well, Laura, you didn't tell us about the dietitian aspect. Come on, I want you to, I'm not going to get away with that, but thank you so much.
Okay, so it's rocket science. It's very difficult. Eat a balanced diet, move your body. If you're stressed, that's not going to help. So, go on vacation. You've heard it from the dietitian, now you can tell your boss.
There you go. Great. Thank you, Laura. Sorry to put you on the spot, but that's important to know. Exactly. Well, I'm delighted that we have as our closer this afternoon a person who's become a friend to me over the years, Bill Benson, through our own connection through the National Association of APS, NAPSA, that I'm privileged to be on the board of as an at-large criminal justice member. And I always appreciate Bill's perspective, but also his calm voice. I don't know whether anyone's ever told you this, Bill, but you are a calming influence during Zoom calls, during telephone calls, at places like this. And not only that, he's other work that he's been involved in, which I'm so impressed with. He's hosted since 2000 interviews called First Person with Holocaust survivors through the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I love going to DC, and I know that on one of our visits, I took my family to that museum, Bill, and it has left an indelible mark on my life. So I just want to thank you for all the work that you do for NAPSA and for getting us to be more aware about the Holocaust. So will you join me in welcoming to the stage my dear friend, Bill Benson. Thank you. And you've got more than 15 minutes.
Thank you, Paul. Paul just said something very dangerous, and especially to you. He said, you have more than 15 minutes. And he didn't say how much more. So it's possible I have 2 hours. And I could talk for 2 hours, but I won't talk for 2 hours. I'll try to keep it relatively limited. I could actually spend my entire time just commenting and thinking about the things that were said by all of my colleagues up here. All wonderful people. I've just met Executive Director Dunn for the first time. Really like him already, and I look forward to a good relationship with him. And the others I know, I've known for a good while, and just all remarkable people. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of them. Even Bob Blancato, it's a pleasure to be with him on the screen. Bob, I just have to say this. We actually share an office in Washington, D.C. The Elder Justice Coalition has the same office in Washington, D.C. as NAPSA, the National Adult Protective Services Association. Laura, I invite you to change places with Bob. Bob can move to Asheville, and we'd like to have you in the office. So if you could convey that back to Bob, we'd appreciate it. It'd be a nice change of pace. No, Bob is, obviously we're good friends because we're in the same office and we do quite well together. And it's an incredible synergy between the Elder Justice Coalition and NAPSA, the National Adult Protective Services Association. Lance, it's always a pleasure to be here with you, and it's just so gratifying to know that you are out working with states. And that's a big deal, and I know a lot of states are taking advantage of your work in doing that. And then Paul is just such a great friend of NAPSA and Adult Protective Services, and helping us to link and bridge to better relationships and understanding with law enforcement and with the criminal justice system and prosecutors has been golden. But I want to share one of my early encounters with Paul, if I could. I paid a visit out to San Diego, where Paul ran the elder abuse unit in the San Diego County District Attorney's Office. And the topic I wanted to see, the reason I went there was not to see Paul, it was to take a look at an elder fatality review team, of which there are not a lot of them in this country. They're starting to gain a little traction. At last count, I think there are 3,000 plus child death review teams all across America, and almost all of them voluntarily driven, almost all of them, with almost no funding. And what they do is they analyze the death of a child. Now, of course, with children, by definition, every death of a child is unexpected. You know, so it meets that test, which we can't say for older adults. But the other side of the coin is not every death of an older person is expected, which is a working assumption, A number of years ago, I forget how many, but minimally 20, 25, in I think it's Prohaska County, Arkansas, the coroner decided that he wanted to examine every death of an older person brought to his attention in that county. He created vibrations that were unbelievable. I mean, and particularly from the nursing home industry, they went ballistic. But he said, I'm finding that these aren't natural causes in far too many of these cases. We need more elder fatality review teams in America. And so I went to see the one in San Diego, and Paul was a member of it. And so I got to meet Paul, and it was such a good illustration. And Paul shared with me, along with Adult Protective Services, they were really two of the critical players, that they had, and what these death review teams do, both for children, there's also maternal mortality review teams. There's about 7 different versions of them that exist in almost every community. Sometimes they're actually in the same place, like they're run out of the medical examiner's office in Philadelphia, for example. But other places, they're run by different entities. But one of the hallmarks of these death review teams, they're not there to pass blame. They're not there to got you. They're to figure out what went wrong. What could we have done differently to avoid this death or even delay it in some cases? And then they produce recommendations about what we can do from a policy perspective. Now, of course, if they find criminal wrongdoing, they pass it on, if that's the conclusion they reached. And one of the recommendations that they came up with in San Diego was, let's run every death, let's ask every death that's brought to the attention of the medical examiner, and correct me if I'm not saying that right, every death that goes by the medical examiner's office that involves an adult, let's just ask the medical examiner to ask APS if they had appeared in their system at any point. Medical examiner said, not a chance, no way, can't do that, not going to yield results, and too expensive. Paul went to work as an advocate, you know, with the strength of a DA's office, and said, we want this, we want this, we want this. And I forget the statistics, but when the medical examiner finally did that, he and everybody else was stunned at the number of people brought to the attention of his office that had had some interaction with APS at some point. Now, that doesn't mean there was anything untoward there. It's a red flag. It's a red flag, gives investigators and others an opportunity to look. And that's just one little teeny thing, along with the AG or district attorney from here, who said earlier that she heard Paul Greenwood speak and the impact on her. Well, that impact on me was like, whoa, the partnership between APS and law enforcement and prosecutors is so important, and it's also important to get other things done, like let's move the needle on death review teams in this country. So Paul, that was long-winded, but I just really appreciate that, and that will stick with me for a long time. Austin, you're great. I'm going to forego my slides in the interest of time, and I am by nature a policy wonk. That's what I do. And when I start looking at all the facts and figures, I get caught up in that, and I'm going to try and avoid that for the most part. However, my very first image on the cover shot, which I'm not going to ask you to do, yeah, I am going to ask you to do that. Just to come to think of it, I am going to ask you to do that. And there's a reason for this. I saw that machine and learned about that machine at your conference last year. Remember, it's an ATM for Bitcoins. I'd never heard of such a thing, ever. But one of our panelists was Philip Gentile. Philip Gentili, who is a postal inspector, chief postal inspector. And he was telling us about these Bitcoin ATMs. I'm like, what the heck is that? So after he finished his formal remarks, I said, tell me more. How do they work? How do you know about them? So he pulls up his phone, does GPS, and showed me where everyone was in Gatlinburg, where we happen to be. I just had to see it. So I go down after the conference ended. I drive downtown Gatlin. I find Gatlinburg. And in this little, honestly, sleazy, divey little souvenir store and whatever else it was, there's that. No regular ATM, but you know how places would have that sign on the front door that says ATM here? It had that sign, but it was no ordinary ATM. It was a Bitcoin ATM. And the significance was that the bad guys reach out to their victims. It's often used for money mules with drugs, apparently. But older people, get them on the phone, say, you got to wire money in order to win this prize or whatever it is. Go put your cash in this machine, and here's how you can find it. Here's how you can get it on your GPS. So you can imagine an older adult finding their way down into this divey place, putting their money, and in a nanosecond, it is converted into Bitcoins and gone forever. I read the other day that the number of ATMs, ordinary ATMs in America, are declining, which I thought was fascinating because people don't carry cash. So there's less of them today than there used to be. I found that really interesting. But I wonder if Bitcoin ATMs are rising. They're on the up, it'd be my guess. So that's the only image I want, Austin, thank you. But I learned about that last year. I was astonished. I've gone back and tried to talk to everybody about trying to learn more about these things. But talk about ubiquitous in the world of elder abuse and financial scams and the intersection with technology in that particular case. So before I go on, and I didn't do this, not only this wonderful panel, but Aaron and his team, Tracy, all the good people that Aaron has around to support this conference, Renee Bouchelon, the APS administrator here, Jim, you and your staff. I'm just so delighted that you're all here together, and all the folks from law enforcement. It's to use cooperation, collaboration, coordination, the 3 C's. This just really embodies that, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. And Mr. Dunn, I'm a former state long-term care ombudsman. The bane of my life were unlicensed board and care homes, and to think that you've got somebody addressing that as an issue is really cool to me. You know, that remains a huge issue all over the landscape. I also want to acknowledge the CREST team, and there's another program, the name has escaped me in Tennessee, but they're really important associated collaborative enterprises with Adult Protective Services. What they do is invaluable, and we don't have an analog for that in an awful lot of places. And so I salute you. I know you were made possible by the ARPA funds, and God willing, there's going to be ways to continue that as best we can. I would like to, I don't want to give you a bunch of data about Adult Protective Services or elder abuse because you know it, but there is one I'm going to talk about. And for those of you who were in my session this morning and some other remarks I'm going to make, forgive me for repeating what I said in the session this morning. But for all the right reasons, there is so much increased emphasis on financial exploitation. Financial exploitation cases are the fastest rising group of cases, reports being made to Adult Protective Services everywhere in the country. More and more. Why? You know, it's that famous old Willie Sutton story, right? You know, why did you rob banks, Willie? Well, that's where the money is. And, you know, why do you steal from old people? Because that's where the money is, Willie would tell us today. And so it's no surprise that with the demographics and the collective amounts of money that older people hold. Now, that collective amount runs the gamut from vast amounts to, you know, very small retirement accounts, but it is a big prize. It's a big goal of scamsters. But we've had a really difficult time trying to quantify that. How much is actually really lost, especially since we know data like 1 out of every 23 cases of physical, sexual, emotional, psychological abuse are unreported. to authorities like APS or police. They go unreported, 1 out of 23. We know that number from the best prevalence study is that it's 1 out of 44 for financial exploitation cases. But what we don't know is what's the actual number until recently. A number of years ago, MetLife Foundation, which no longer exists, put out a report and they estimated it was $2.9 billion in losses annually for older people to financial exploitation. An organization called SecurityLink several years later put out the figure $39 billion. Huge difference. Nobody took the $39 billion amount seriously. There are all kinds of questions about methodology and all that. But everybody also knew the MetLife approach was also flawed because it was based entirely on newspaper stories. The amounts of money of cases that made it into the press, which is a very small number, and that's how they came up with that number. But trying to come up with that number has been very difficult until recently. On June 15th, it was the 15th, World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. On that day that we were holding NAPSA's event that we do with FINRA, the securities regulator, which is a great event. On that same date, AARP released its report on financial exploitation of older people. And it's stunning. And it's the amount that they have tagged in that report is annually, the losses are $28.3 billion. That's real money. It makes me think of that legendary story about Senator Russell Long from Louisiana long ago. But he was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which is the big money committee, Medicare and Social Security and tax policy. And he was chairman of the Finance Committee, I'm sorry, not Ways and Means, Finance in the Senate. And I'm going to try to pretend to do an accent, so bear with me. But the greatest quote from him is he'd go, well, $1 million here, you find $1 million over there, and before long, you got real money. And I've always been one of my favorites. So 29 billion is real money, and no matter how you cut it. And there's two things that are amazing about that. One is we know most things aren't reported. So what is that real figure? But the second, and the far more, in my mind, distressing, disturbing, insidious, confounding bit of data is that, first of all, the vast majority of people are abused financially by known others. And of those, 87 of those who report having been financially abused by a known other, a family member, a clergy member, a financial advisor, somebody they know at the bank or lots of other places, a known other, 87.5% of them said they do not report it. They did not report it. That's a staggering sum. For those who were scammed or abused by, the way AARP puts it, unknown others, is 65%. I'm sorry, 65% report. So about 1/3 don't. So we're getting a lot more reports by the unknown others, but we're not getting them about what takes place inside families. And in dollar terms, 72% of the $28.3 billion is attributed to known others. So known others are doing the majority of the financial exploitation, and they're taking the majority of the money, and they're not getting the attention. And that's a tough issue. And I think for me, it's an incredible illustration of how difficult the work is for Adult Protective Services and everybody else in this field, because it's in families to a very great extent. And we need to, step back. And I'm thinking about Lance's comment about making it personal. That's as personal as it gets for the most part. We've got real challenges to try to begin to erode and change and turn those numbers around when we know that it's within families and known, trusted others. That's a huge challenge for all of us. And it's going to take some serious soul searching for us to figure out how best to address that. that particular issue. It's not easy to go after the unknown others, the person who's from some Canadian province, who's got some scam going, or, in Nigeria or wherever they might be offshore, or even in another state. But to know that they are in your neighborhood, in your community, and that's where the majority of them are, is a huge challenge for all of us. And so I think, Lance, you're right. If we can help, inoculate our own families, figure that out. But I want to also mention that, and I've never thought about that until I was looking at this report in the same way. I have the privilege of also being the president of an organization called the International Association for Indigenous Aging, IA², which I co-founded with my dear friend Dave Baldrige, who's a member of the Cherokee Nation, 21 years ago. And we recently were given the honor of running the Native American Elder Justice Resource Center, which had been operated by the University of North Dakota. We now operate it for the Administration for Community Living. It's a big deal. And looking at the resources we're going to use for trying to address elder abuse in tribal communities and in the American Indian Alaska Native population, one of the pieces of the curriculum that's used is a course on how to be a better family member. And I think we need that in our work, how to be a better family member. You don't take grandma's Social Security check. You don't take groceries out of the refrigerator because you can't afford to go buy your own, so let's just take Granny's, and all the many other iterations. So I'm going back with a commitment that we're going to come up with how to be better families in some way, shape, or form so that we can begin to erode that. I took more time on that, but I'm just really moved by those numbers. On the policy front, fortunately, Bob covered a great deal of it very quickly, so I don't think I need to go through all of that. But we are in a really, as always, we're always in an interesting time, The Elder Justice Modernization and Reauthorization Act is really important. Unfortunately, it needs to be a bipartisan bill if it's going to go anywhere. Right now, its chief sponsors are all Democrats. And what it does is, first and foremost, it reauthorizes the Elder Justice Act. As Bob said, we've been without it for 13 years. We need an Elder Justice Act. And within the Elder Justice Act, it's the authorization for sending money to states to support their adult protective service programs. We really need to authorize that. But even more significantly, that legislation has really serious money for adult protective services and for the Ombudsman program and for the other things that both Laura and Bob talked about. It's really important. I think we're going to have a very tough time moving that bill over the next 2 years, but anything you can do with your own delegation to get them to co-sponsor the Elder Justice Act, the Elder Justice Modernization and Reauthorization Act is really, really important if we can get there. And I hope that we can. Bob gave the figures a moment ago. We just took a sort of breathtaking drop in funding to states for adult protective services. It's not unexpected, and I'll explain why. Because the Elder Justice Act became law in 2010, authorizing money to states for APS and other things that are really important, but it took 11 years for the first dollar to go to states. The first dollar, that was 2021. And then we got big dollars between 2021, but by our standards, big dollars. It's, we've lowered our expectations about what big is. But it was $276 million, which was a big deal. It allowed states to do a lot of important things. But there was a sort of an unrecognized poison pill in that money. First, the money came from special purpose legislation, not from the annual appropriations bill, just like the Tennessee legislature appropriates money annually. These were special purpose bills. One was a COVID relief bill, and the second was the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA as it's known. So they were not regular business at all. They were not regular they bypassed appropriations. So it was one-time money. It was so gratefully received by APS everywhere, no question about it. But that bit of a poison pill was because it was special purpose money. Many states' budget officers and finance department and others said, we can't let you fill FTEs with this money because it's short term. You know, if you fill an FTE, if you hire somebody and this money's not renewed, then we got to let that person go. So it's bad policy to hire people. Well, there is no other asset in adult protective services than people. That's all there is, investigators and caseworkers and, you know, other staff, but that's all there is. It's not like the meals program where at least you know you got to pay for food and you got to pay for refrigerators and kitchens and trucks to deliver it. APS, it's just people, and they need people, and they're losing people, and the demographics that we've been talking about mean that if for no other reason whatsoever, the number of reports made to adult protective services and law enforcement go up every year just because the numbers go up. And if we believe the statistic that 1 out of every 10 older person experiences some kind of abuse a year, those numbers are astronomical. Even if most of them aren't, maybe it's thank God they're not reported in some sense. But we need people in APS and they couldn't hire them. And so now that money's out there, it's got to be spent, we think, completely done by the end of 2024. Now we wanted to get regular appropriations, and we did. That's the really good news. For FY23, we got $15 million for the entire state, for the entire country, for 50 states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the territories, to support APS. It dropped from $276 million to $15 million. It now means, as ACL put in their bulletin in the Federal Register, you can hire staff. Well, as one APS program told us, my share of that is less than one full-time equivalent. But I don't want to be cynical. The good news is it's in the appropriations process. It means that we can start to at least finally, through advocacy, we hope, begin to build on that and provide the kind of money that APS needs so that they can begin to not only hire the new people because they need them from a demographic standpoint, but the people that they've been losing because of burnout and stress and the fact that, why am I doing this horribly difficult job when I can go across the street to Walmart and earn maybe less, who knows, but a far less stressful job. And that in fact is happening. So the good news is we are now in the appropriations cycle. We need any of your delegation who are members of appropriations committees, House or Senate, to know about the importance of this. So I know it's getting time for me to wrap up because I will use up all that time if I don't stop. The last thing that I want to say that Bob didn't talk about, because Bob knows that no matter where I am, I will talk about it. Everywhere I go, I will talk about it. And I especially have to talk about it in Tennessee, and that is the Social Services Block Grant. Historically, whenever I spoke, I would ask the audience, who here knows about SSBG? And most of the time, okay, I'll do it here. Raise your hand if you know about SSBG. That is wonderful, because historically, there'd be no one raising their hands. The reason you do is because we've done a good job of finally persuading and educating about why SSBG is the lifeline for adult protective services. And it truly is, and it truly is especially so in the state of Tennessee. SSBG, the reason people didn't know about it is because it's a block grant with this bizarre name, Social Services Block Grant. It goes to states then it disappears into their budget machinery, and then it gets sent out different places. Maybe various state agencies, maybe county agencies, maybe not-for-profits. And as a block grant, when it goes down the chain, it's not called SSBG in many states. It's called, it's called the New Mexico Human Services Fund, when really it's SSBG. So for policymakers, they don't even know what it is. It's unknown, SSBG. What is it? Except that it's a big pot of money. It's $1.7 billion that gets divided up with almost no strings attached to states. The only string really for states is that they have to spend it on one of 29 services. That's a lot of services. And one of those 29 services is adult protective services. Another one is child protective services. There's domestic violence, there's mental health, there's substance abuse. It's a big pot of money for human services. So states have the choice. They can spend it all on one service, they can spend it on all 29 services, or 3 of them. That's their choice. Completely up to them. But it so happens that every year, roughly 37 states choose to spend that money on adult protective services. And in a handful of states, and Tennessee is one of those, they choose to fully fund adult protective services from their social services block grant allocation. So without SSBG, you would have a crisis in Tennessee. Tennessee would need to go to its legislature and say, cough up the general revenue, or let all these people go, one or the other. That's the choice, because there aren't other free-floating pots of money out there very often. So it's either general revenue, or you could do as Pennsylvania did, which is dedicate their lottery money to aging services, but most states don't do that. But that's what we would face if we were to see a loss of SSBG, and that's not an ethereal issue. We have at NAPSA, our priority has never been the Elder Justice Act or APS funding through the Elder Justice Act. It's number 2. Number 1 is protecting SSBG because of those 37 states that rely on it to fund their APS programs. And over the course of the years, we've had several attempts, both in the House and the Senate, and even from the White House, to eliminate SSBG. And SSBG is a very attractive target because you're trying to figure out how to get savings. You look at the budget, you don't know what SSBG really is, but you see in one fell swoop, I can save $1.7 billion. And presto, it could be gone. There have been offers to work groups against each other. God bless the children's advocates, particularly groups like the Child Welfare Association of America. I think that's their name. There was leading senators who went to them and said, we're going to work a deal with you. We're going to cut SSBG by half, but we'll put it all into child welfare. And CWLA, or whatever they're, the Child Welfare League of America, that's it. They said, no deal. We're in this together with adults and seniors and others. And I mean, they stepped up to the plate big time. And when we're in tough budgetary times, which we are in and we are going to be in for the next several years in light of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, SSBG sits out there. And so my homework assignment to you is to educate your delegation about SSBG. And in Tennessee, it's not just used for adult protective services, it's used for 29 services, or some of them, and others that are for older adults, including services that are important to APS clients, like home delivered meals, for example, case management services, home care services. It can be used for all of those. So even if a state doesn't spend it on APS or much of it, they're using it to support their clients in different ways. So SSBG is really important to adult protective services and to victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And it's especially important in some states more so than others, Tennessee being one of those. So help us to educate your delegation that as they think about all that they're going to think about in this 2-year Congress that we're in now and beyond, that they understand that SSBG is significant and why it's significant. That's my assignment to you. My takeaway last year was that Bitcoin machine. My takeaway today, my favorite line, which I heard in the first 10 minutes today, was when the congressman was here earlier today. He turned to Aaron Bradley and he said, you know, you were a pain in my neck all through my years in the state legislature. And that was such a wonderful endorsement, of what we all need to do, and that is to be pains in the neck or even other parts of the anatomy, because the advocacy is so absolutely necessary. That's a message from everybody. Aaron, wear that as a badge of honor, and I know that you do. You know, it's and just you should. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
That's a great note to finish on.